Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be looking into the future with the awareness of today, trying to find a way that we can merge from nonlinear into linear and together with quantum thinking. The book is Brave New Mind, Living in a Future Science World. Our guest joining us on the program today is Dr. Elliot Maynard. How are you doing, Elliot?
Fine, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I was really wrapping my mind around this because of the fact that I seem to be talking to a lot of people this day and age who feel that time seems accelerated. Have you been having that kind of an experience?
Absolutely, and according to the New Age pundits, we are in a time of very, very accelerated change. They like to call it the ascension frequency or various other monikers. But yes, we're being impacted by amazing new discoveries almost every single day, more than you can count on your fingers.
Well, I can imagine that too, and I kind of had a little bit of a theory about this because we live in a day and an age where our instant gratification is all over the place. You've got cell phones, people are on computers. Whatever we need, it's pretty much at the push of a button. In this day and age, it's hard to find anybody who isn't walking around with one of those iPhones attached to their hands. And I think because we don't seem to feel like we're waiting anymore, like we used to, for instance, that's what's pushing our time faster. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Well, there's no doubt that a large percentage of the population in the civilized countries of the world are essentially addicted to their electronic, what one scientist friend of mine calls the electronic tit. In other words, it's a kind of a teething ring, if you want to call it. The technology, as I see it, is always a double-edged sword, and there are times to leave the technology at home, go out in the snow if it's wintertime, or go out into nature if it's spring or summer, and interact with the natural energy of this Earth and this planet, which we, as humans, has been a survival factor for us for millions of years.
Mm-hmm. I like when I was reading in the book right off the bat, you're talking about how science and religion they need each other for the most part, because science is, of course, about exploration, and religion is about the faith of that exploration. And it was such a unique time when it was sort of split and divided against each other, and how that all started coming together. Can you describe for our listeners how this all happened?
Yes. As far as my own personal experience, I was always an individual that wanted to color outside the lines in certain ways and break the molds and create new paradigms. So it's something that I know others who are in certain leadership positions have done this too. And what happened was that I had been associated with a number of different organizations in aerospace and in psychic technology, such as the American Psychotronics Association, which deals with radionics and nonlinear technologies and has for years. Now, just 2 decades ago, we weren't able, scientists and medical professionals were not really allowed to talk about bringing the art into science or medicine. But now, my experience has been, after knowing a number of very, very excellent, some of the best surgeons in the world and some of the best scientists in the world, that when you get to know them, they all admit that they use their intuitive senses, and we could have not done this and talked about it just a couple of, maybe 20 years ago. So It's all coming out. The cats are all coming out of the bag at once, it seems.
Well, I think, too, what's really important, as we've talked about this on the program, is especially in the area of academia and science, is that too many people a lot of times try to save face, so therefore they don't boldly step into new directions and new discoveries and bring them to the light. To give you an example, my wife had brought home a movie, a most excellent movie actually, called Anonymous. And in this movie, it's about whether or not Shakespeare actually wrote the works that he's been attributed to. And this has apparently been a debate that's been going on for many years. And so we were talking about this with a friend of ours, and he got very frustrated with this because Shakespeare happens to be one of his, I guess, pet projects, so to speak, and he's actually writing a book on Shakespeare. And the fact that there are a lot of people that made whole careers on the works of Shakespeare. Now, you go and you start rattling some cages claiming, well, this guy probably wasn't the person who did this, but it was someone else. And, you find that within the circles of academia, whether it could be, for instance, the works of Shakespeare or whether it's astronomy, whatever it is, you see that there's a lot of, call it bureaucratic tie-up from somebody coming in with a bold new theory about, well, why don't we explore this and take that step? That it kind of holds back. And they say that it takes an average of about 30 years for a new idea to finally sink in and people to accept it. And you're saying what we need is more of those renegades that are out there pushing sort of the envelope, if you will.
Oh, you really nailed it, Dan.
Oh, believe me, I've had a lot of talks, and I get really tired of, our so-called advanced educational system where people are going in and they're hearing a bunch of theories from people who have no real practical experience with what they're teaching and trying to claim that this is higher education.
Right. Well, in my book, I do have a new educational system that because I have worked in education, I've been a university teacher, and I've helped design courses for the Hopi tribe in northern Arizona, and actually worked in areas of junior high school. So I've walked the talk in most everything I've written about. And one of my great frustrations is the amazing lengths that people will go to couch themselves in very elaborate forms of denial. I mean, witness the very strange vehicles driving around. It's like a look at me. And I'm not knocking people that like mechanics and special cars and all this, but my God, it seems that a large percentage of our population is very, very interested in creating new diversions instead of facing the real reality show. And one of the most important things for success is to face your problems directly. If they seem very large at one time, it's like eating an elephant. You do it one bite at a time. Mm-hmm. And there's an old Hindu saying that kind of wraps this up back to what you were saying. It's better to be a tiger for one day than a sheep for 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. So what we need is a few million tigers, and we can change the world just like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that, when you take a look at journalism, as it's so-called today, I mean, we're running into that problem. People who are afraid to actually tell us the news because they lose careers. And there was even one person who commented, he says, what we need to do is fire all these editors, get some people in there that actually do the news like it used to be done, so we know where we're at and move forward, sort of a thing. So, now, what I was really amazed by was the particular chapter when you were talking about the idea of us being into the quantum field of thinking, is that we were actually there, and you take a look at ancient civilizations, and they seem to have a better handle on this than we do this day and age with technology. Again, I think part of it is the way we suppress and hold on to old ideas as though they are sort of the religious modality, so to speak. But you were talking about how one of the ways of doing it, and I was kind of surprised to see this in this book, was about divining.
Yeah.
Now tell us about that, how that came about, because it started making a lot of sense. I thought, here we're actually in tune with our thinking, using tools that are very, very basic, a couple of wires, so to speak, to be able to do some very complicated things.
Well, yes, this is one of my pet little projects that I guess as a kid, I discovered my uncle and my dad at my summer camp. They were up in a certain area looking for a buried water pipe, and they were using a natural fork that came from an apple or some sort of tree like that. And I actually got to hold it and walk over the buried pipe, and it twisted down so hard that it actually tore the bark off the fresh cut limb. Now, I use dowsing in a much different way, and I've been teaching people how to do this. I use a couple little L rods, so-called, which You can find it in the book described, and also, you can use a pendulum. But what I do is encourage people to use this as a little tool for interfacing with a quantum field. And you can ask any question that you want answered. I use this daily. I carry a set of these with me everywhere I go. And if I want to know, should I go to this appointment, or is this going to be a successful outcome, or which of several possibilities would be the best one to run with? And so here you go. It's a perfect little way to interface with the quantum information field, which is what the whole book is about.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know one of the big debates that we're having, and you actually talk about this and in such a way that you kind of feel, well, maybe it's not a bad thing, and that is of genetic modification, especially when it comes to the food supply. I mean, look at the debate that we're having about that. Share your thoughts about that particular debate.
Oh, you picked a hot potato.
Well, I had to. I mean, for instance, I'll give you an idea. One of the things, and I had actually worked in seafood many years ago, and it was starting to happen then, and you think of, for instance, just the sheer volume of restaurants, just restaurants, that produce and serve seafood. It almost seems unbelievable that you can even find a supply that can meet that demand all over the world. So now, of course, we start genetically farming salmon. And now we feed these salmon corn.
Yes,
and you start looking at this weird loop and going, how could that even be healthy? So anyway.
Well, I actually did. I happened, one of the disciplines I worked into from the Oceanographic Lab in Florida was doing pioneering work with giant freshwater shrimp culture. And at that time, we were some of the very first in America to use this new technology. We raised the native stock that was existing in South Florida, and we thought this was a way we were going to feed the world. I was also working on spirulina culture, spirulina is one of the highest forms of protein, and NASA had selected it for one of the ideal space foods in freeze-dried form. Now, what I have to say about genetic engineering is this. Like many things, money or dynamite, you can use it for good or bad. You can use a sword to kill people, or you can hold it up to attract the light, to create an analogy. Now, whether we like it or not, genetic engineering is going to continue. And when you really step back and look at it, it's nothing but the natural process of selective breeding, selecting the best brood stock over many, many, many generations. How all of our domestic animals are now food animals come from this kind of source. So I look at it as a God-given gift, if you want to put it that way, and we simply need to use our scientific knowledge and wisdom, and I underline that wisdom, to try our best to avoid unintended consequences. And I take as an example this Aqua Bounty salmon that has been patented, and nowhere has anyone proved that there's any reason not to eat this fish. I would eat one. Mm-hmm. And because this fish will grow to a large size in a third or a fourth of the time of the wild stock. You can control your food just as you were talking about. You don't want GM products, then you can prepare your own food. You have a closed system which conserves water, it conserves energy, and you can have an aquaculture operation right in the heart of a city in an old abandoned factory. This is already being done with certain types of fish and other things. Mm-hmm. So here we go, and I think genetic engineering has a bad rap, but I think perhaps history will prove that the whole Monsanto thing has had a great benefit in alerting the public to some very, very darker scenarios that could have happened up the road, especially with radioactive products and this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So I think that, and ultimately we all get to vote with our wallets. If you don't want GM products, don't buy them. There's a simple way to label, which is just having it either has GM products in it or it doesn't. So you can put the little red circle with a slash through it.
Mm-hmm.
So we all vote with our wallets. If you don't like Monsanto, don't buy Roundup and use it in your driveway. There are other things you can use.
Mm-hmm.
And Monsanto would be the first to, their bottom line dropped, I believe, in the last quarter, very significantly, 40% or something.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. And there'll be a lot of argument on that one, I'm sure.
And that alone is really, as I was seeing, kind of an underlying thread in your book, is the idea that people stay, I guess, stuck in their belief of their ideas. Okay, for instance, living in Portland, Oregon just recently, last year actually, is that we actually voted and were able to turn down the prospect of having fluoride put into our drinking water, which makes Portland the largest city in America that has non-fluoridated water. And I found it was interesting about this debate. My first approach to it was, well, why would we want to put fluoride in the water to the level that they suggest when in nature you really don't find fluoride to that level naturally? It just doesn't make sense. That's the way I looked at it. I would call that reason, if you will. But, on the other hand, you have people who have decided, well, we should put fluoride. In fact, what was going to happen is the city planners decided they were just going to go ahead and do that, but it was discovered it was about to happen, and so therefore it came to a vote rather than just these people deciding, for everybody what they were going to do. But how they were so adamant, not just the people who decided they were going to do it, but the people who started supporting this during the voting process, trying to convince you this is a good thing, and how they're so adamant about their ideas. And when you would actually start asking people, a fair amount of them weren't very knowledgeable about any of it. They were just saying, well, I just believe we should do this. And you kind of wonder sometimes how anything ever gets done.
I know, and this is what happens when we have our elected officials, and many of the government agencies, and the post office is a good example. People, these institutions, after a certain point, begin to generate more and more bureaucratic red tape and gatekeeping, and so when you have an elected official, they become focused on covering their butts, essentially. In other words, they don't want to make a decision that they could be held accountable for. It's just part of the way that the system works. Now,
right.
You have a population that got it together and made a choice. If people want fluoride in their toothpaste, you can go get toothpaste with fluoride in it.
Right.
Now, the dumb part of this is that putting fluoride in the water is very stupid because it affects pregnant mothers and very young children whose metabolism goes very much faster. This is why children are always at risk. And this is just one example of using a kind of a shotgun approach when if you did want dental fluoride, you can use a mouthwash or a toothpaste. Now, another example is cortisone. Instead of taking it into your whole system, it's possible to inject it into certain areas if you have inflamed joints and provide some relief so healing can take place. You don't have to put it into the whole system. It's really bad science from my own personal point of view.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things we're going to be talking about here in the upcoming weeks is that of 3D printing. And, sometimes you kind of shiver about the possibilities. For instance, in China, as I understand it, they're able to build a whole house using a 3D printer, and you have to imagine, well, what size is this 3D printer? Because I think most people, when they think of printing, they think of the copiers they have on their desktops, whatever the case is. Talk about 3D printing, because you even hear all the way to they can put the DNA from somebody into these things and possibly 3D print organs for organ replacement. Open our eyes about this, would you?
Okay, it's already happening, and this is one of the amazing technologies that in the World Future Society group, we used to call it a wild card. This is something that just popped up. And the beauty of this system, if you step back again and kind of take an overview of it, is that all this time when we've been using from the Industrial Revolution, the tools and the factory lines we set up, if we want to build a rifle barrel, we take a bar of stock of steel and drill a hole through it, usually, and then you have to put the rifling inside, and you're always cutting metal off, always peeling metal off. Now, that takes a lot of labor. It takes expensive machines. You make a lot of waste, so you're generating more, using more electricity, more manpower, all of this. Now, what 3D printing, the beauty of this conceptually is it's called additive technology. You're actually adding instead of subtracting waste material to make your finished product. And they have actually taken, a couple of young fellows designed a new 3D printer that was taken up to the International Space Station. And they actually printed a little ratchet wrench that one of the astronauts said he would really like to have. Now, it looked like it was made out of plastic, so I don't know how well it worked, but the fact that they can do this and print little parts up there that they need, my God, to get 1 pound of material up to orbit or into the International Space Station it's frightfully expensive. So here's a huge breakthrough, and yes, there's a section in the book about how you make houses, and imagine a car wash and that gantry that runs back and forth on the wheels over your car with the brushes. This is how they do it, and after you pour the pad for the house and put the plumbing, electrical, and sewage connections in, all you need to do is create a CAD program, computer-aided design, and it will squirt out the materials back and forth until it's building this thing like Lego blocks up and up and up. And you can actually put curves and very, very intricate and beautiful designs. It's almost like an organic creation. And yes, also they're doing this now with human stem cells. This is going to open up a world of possibilities for the future. I hope I haven't been too long-winded on that.
No, I think it's great that you are because of the possibilities that exist. And to give you an example, back during George W. Bush's first term in office, he was very outspoken about stem cell research in a very negative way. He was like, I'm not going to allow this to happen. Well, I was pretty outraged by that because as a parent of a son who was sitting in the intensive care unit from some strange thing that almost whacked him out of this world, one of the things that it did is it began shutting the kidneys down. Fortunately, he wasn't on dialysis for more than a couple of months, and they began to function again. But I could see the possibility that, well, look, if you can pull stem cells out of somebody and regrow an organ, for instance, how could that be a bad thing? Now, I don't know why he had the position he did, but again, that's one of them locked minds deciding with that kind of power not to allow something to move forward that had possibilities for people like ourselves, But obviously, like you were saying earlier in the program, it really doesn't matter who decides to shut the gate on something. It's going to keep pushing forward anyway.
Absolutely, because there are going to be people like yourself or people who their child has some sort of genetic irregularity. If this can conceivably be cured, these people, for instance, with medical marijuana, when the younger kids have something like this that can be helped, they're moving to states that have legalized this. So it's the shut minds and whatever happened to the separation of church and state? Since when does the church or the government, when does the government get to act like the church used to in medieval times, you see? And so we have this freedom. There's nothing wrong with stem cell research. The problem was when they were taking them from afterbirths and also aborted fetuses, which are available naturally, and doctors themselves put together a stem cell bank from the umbilical cords that were thrown away. And they did this with their own money. I think they did this in Canada. And now you can get stem cells from someone's cheek cells. You just take a little scraping. And you can grow them, culture them from the person you want to use them on.
Mm-hmm. You know, I was really kind of surprised when you were talking about a technology that can transform air pollution into baking soda. What's that all about?
Well, you know, the funny thing is there's some wonderful medical technologies that I've discovered. Several of them are written about in the book, and also this baking soda technology. It transforms particulate ash, which is particularly nasty, because it can get into the lungs and breathing passages. Just for example, you'd think Maine, I grew up in central Maine as a kid, and you'd think that would have very clear air, but because of the coal-fired dirty power plants in the Midwest, the air pollution drifts eastward, and the children in that state have the highest asthma rate, or did have that in the country. So this particulate matter has kind of been overlooked. It's a nasty little, one of those little things that, you know, people uncover at times. So if you can precipitate this with electrostatic precipitators, and this process just turns it into baking soda, and apparently it's so pure you can use it as a cooking or whatever, however you would want to use it, you know, normally.
Mm-hmm. I thought that was really important because going back to, as we were talking about genetic modification, you know, again, there's the debate from people who believe, and in some cases without any real evidence, that this isn't a good thing. And I think, well, there are a lot of people who grow up wanting to be scientists, so they go and they educate and they become scientists. So, you know, what jobs really are out there, for instance, for people who want to go into science, and so they start going to places like Monsanto, which I think maybe they don't produce a lot of good things that are really good for the environment, probably, like you were talking about Roundup earlier. But this is a place where they can at least research, you know, and when you start reading, especially in your book, Brave New Mind, how you begin to see these new frontiers of how we're beginning to deal with waste. In other words, we're taking waste and turning it into something that's productive. You kind of start scratching your head and saying, you know, why not allow these companies to do that? You don't have to buy the products they produce that you believe aren't very good for you, but, you know, kind of take a look at what they're really doing. Is that a better paradigm to look at this whole thing at?
Absolutely, and you know, I have had the experience of working very closely with some government and corporate, private corporate enterprise, and sometimes side by side. You have to think, when you go into a company like Monsanto, your idea, the ivory tower university is a very, very slow and expensive way to get an education. And when you have your diploma in hand, and even a PhD, that in $2, if you're lucky, will get you a cup of coffee, you know. So that's about the extent of it. I'm very, very much in favor of young folks who are brilliant going right into the workplace, but mainly working with their special programs, because many of these corporations have found that they actually have to re-educate people when they come out of the education system that exists now in our country. That's pretty sad.
Well, what's funny about that is how true it is. Many years ago, I used to entertain and earn a living as a bartender. And I remember going on an interview one time for a position, and they were pretty adamant in asking me, so did you attend a bartending school? And I kept saying, no, I jumped into the trenches and learned how to make margaritas like you should, right?
Right.
And they were very relieved. And as a matter of fact, as I started the job, they had actually hired a guy who came from one of these bartending schools. And I was thinking, what do they teach these people in these schools that are making these people so apprehensive about hiring them? Crazy stuff.
Well, when you step back, I sometimes, you know, kind of tongue-in-cheek tell people, well, think of yourself if you came from a very enlightened and advanced civilization and you came upon Earth and you began to observe what was going on down there, and some of these things would seem so inexplicable, I've had several discussions with some leading-edge scientists, and we've all come to the conclusion that if anyone tries something radically new, almost automatically, there will be a certain percentage of people who often you called your friends and thought were your supporters, who will simply kind of become very illogical, as Spock would say, and actually throw tantrums about just because what you're doing has gone too far beyond their comfort zone, their own comfort zone of delusion, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think in final, because we do talk a lot about this on the program, and that is of health and nutrition, and superfoods have certainly been something that you see more and more being advertised, but being more readily available. I mean, we're looking at nutrition this day and age to a level that we've never experienced in human history, and again, you'd have a debate there too. I know of companies that actually have created ponds, for instance, where they can grow that super blue-green algae, known as spirulina, and I actually use this, and it's amazing the awareness levels that you find yourself getting to as you use things like superfoods, to a point that you begin, and I know this is going to sound crazy, but this is about stretching ourselves here, folks. Psychic ability, that cognitive ability that starts opening up where you can actually see things before they happen, and you can even sidestep it a little bit and see it happen, but it doesn't happen to you, so to speak. And I know people might think of psychic ability as being hokey science, but I believe it's something that inherently is natural within the human species.
In my world, it would be one of the things that all families, all teachers, all religious leaders, and even in the military and corporate leaders would encourage in their people, because, again, virtually all of the very great leaders that I've known, people like Robert Mueller, Assistant Secretary General for the United Nations 3 times, he drafted the Marshall Plan. I got to know him pretty well, and these guys all have a special ability, and very often they never talk about it unless you know them really well or they're near the end of their lives. And yes, when you begin to work with microalgae, I've worked with both spirulina and chlorella, which is a smaller green algae. The consciousness actually can affect this food and bring it up vibrationally. Now, when I say vibrationally, that would mean that an independent psychic, or several, so you could correlate it, psychic people would look at this food and say, this is a very high-energy food. We do have some instruments that measure this kind of thing. And it's very much like your great-grandmother who used to make a special kind of jam from the raspberries that grew outside. And, and then give those things away. What a gift. What a great gift, because every time you put some of that jam on your toast or drink some wine made out of blackberries from the garden, it's magical food, and your whole consciousness can be changed. We could actually really work on food this way. This is talked about in the book, and bring the level of vibration up so that it would create a super intelligent human for the future, which I like to call Homo novus.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of superfoods, you were talking about how sugar was one of those that are so embedded in the American lifestyle that up until there was a 60 Minutes interview where a doctor was laying out, look, this is responsible for a lot of these types of things such as obesity, type 2, 3 diabetes, on and on and on. And when you take a look at how much sugar is permeated through, especially the fast food diet, that before this particular airing of this program on 60 Minutes from this doctor here, that we weren't really talking about that in the scientific community as being really the root cause of a lot of these kind of diseases and sicknesses that we suffer from here in America.
Yes, it's a very simple way. We've been inundated with sugar for, several decades. I think when they started putting the vending machines in schools, which is, I don't know when they did that, in the 50s or something, that was the beginning of it. And if you start looking at the behavior of children, prior to that time, they were not giving kids who were a little bit distracted, which they now call ADD kids, or that's the adult form. But dysfunctionality can be corrected by a healthy basic diet, and a lot of these kids, a half a century ago, were living on a farm where most of their families or friends raised their own vegetables, so they had good food without even knowing about it before they got the junk food bombardment.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of money in that sugar,
Yeah, there sure is, especially when you've got mountains of corn that you need to turn into something.
Yes, right. Yes.
I think if anybody's ever seen King Corn, I think is the name of the documentary, you just stand there astounded at the ways they try to use this, and you have to ask yourself, why are we producing so much of this stuff?
Yeah. Well, now on the other side of the coin, we can produce grains that will have missing vitamins and help blindness in third world countries that is caused simply by an inefficient diet, a very poor diet, an unbalanced diet. And, then when you start to do this, and you still have people, there's an inertia for this reproduction that comes from this ancient cycle of kill or be killed and empires rising and falling. And 100 or 200 years ago, it was very important to produce a lot of children if you had a farm and land, because you needed them to help with gardening. The death of the mothers was very high, and children as well, so you need to keep producing a lot of children. Now, this still has an inertia which is killing us all if we don't simply become aware of it, and it begins in the mind and heart and will free women from this kind of enslavement that still exists in certain cultures that are using the old paradigms and bringing them into the future where they no longer fit for survival.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're also seeing more often now couples who have decided not to have children, and it's funny how there's even a debate about that. It's like, this is a lifestyle choice they should be free to make.
Well, I have something to say about that.
Okay.
Nobody talks about the elephant in the room, but so I read somewhere this following statement. And you want to think before you have kids, because they're a great responsibility and may be with you all your lives now without the extended family environment we used to have. Children can ruin your life. Someone said that. And it's funny, but it's not funny, because I know a number of people that have had some very hard times with their children. I know others that have taken foster children and been wonderful parents. But it requires a lot of thinking, because it costs several $100,000 to raise a kid if you're going to be in a middle-class society, at least now.
Mm-hmm.
Got all the medical and educational things, and now it's cars and cell phones, electronics, and this and that and the other thing. And it's rather sad that many of our leading educational institutions have become famous for their athletic teams, and I'm not against athletics, but what kind of a advertisement is that for a new and enlightened civilization when this is supposed to be a learning university, and the original meaning of that word was to become educated in all things, kind of a Renaissance term.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually produced a segment about banning football, so to speak, and taking a look at that whole structure in and of itself. And it gets pretty ugly when you look underneath the veil to realize how much a system like that is supported by people, that outside of being fans have no real direct involvement in it.
Yes, so, and I do. I watch games and all of this, and so and I actually was in the Olympic trials and swimming, and so I love sports, but not to the exclusion of the focus of what a university is supposed to be all about. And There are other ways to build teamwork. I went to a liberal arts university that actually did not have any football scholarships or basketball because they had a cheating scandal at one point. They had an honor system, and so they just did away with athletic scholarships.
You know, speaking of that, I want to make a movie recommendation that I think is very in line with not only what we're talking about here, but your book as well, and it's called Quantum Hoops. Have you heard of that one?
No, I haven't.
This is a wonderful documentary. It's narrated by David Duchovny of the X-Files, and it talks about Cal State, okay, or Caltech, excuse me, okay, which is just like MIT. You know, they're a prestigious engineering university. And what happens here is, you know, to get into Caltech, like MIT, you know, you really got to have your mind and all that together to be in places like this.
Yes, absolutely.
But here in this college, they have a basketball team, and it goes back as far as the 1930s, I believe it was, or the 1920s, when the university was founded. And it was founded for engineering, for the pursuit of science and evolution, like what we're talking about here. But they have both a men and women's basketball team now. But anyway, what's fascinating about this documentary is that here was a team that had a college record for the most consecutive years of losses, 24 in a row. Okay, they had never won a game for 24 years.
But I bet they had a lot of fun playing.
But there was a time that they actually beat, for instance, UCLA by 2, that they used to be considered a rival match, you know, but it would be hard to imagine. But that was back in the 1930s or 40s, I believe it was. But anyway, the point is when you attend Caltech, if you want to play on the basketball team, all you got to do is walk onto the court, and you're on the team. They're not recruiting basketball players. As they were saying in this documentary, the students that come here with a totally different set of priorities. You know, but here this first year as this documentary is starting might be the first year that they actually win a game, and that's going to be a big thing. But, you know, just like what you're talking about, they should really be putting the sports and athletic stuff away, and sure, the universities tout, well, they bring in millions of dollars that help support the university. Well, think about what would happen if you changed that paradigm into the direction we're talking about, and the university became more about exploration and developing the mind into a thinking rather than a replicating way of doing things.
That's a wonderful illusion. Parroting. This is one of my really big objections to established education. When I finally got into graduate school, I had this kind of vision that, finally we're getting rid of these damn tests, which I hate because it's just parroting back. And my mind is a bit different from others, and you know, a twisted mind is a terrible thing to waste.
It sure is.
So anyway, my mind always used to read in are there answers to the questions, and that was not good in a test that is made up for this mythical norm. So my education system, instead of always aiming toward the norm, would take each person individually, is go from kindergarten and begin to develop them from their own core, and then add other areas of expertise which could dovetail into this. I have a math block, for instance, and at one point in graduate school, I had an advisor that told me I should take some advanced calculus, a tutorial, and I had such a terrible time with it. I said, look, I'm not going to waste my time on this. I've got experts in other fields that I want to study, and if I need a mathematician, I'll hire one or something. And I got a nasty letter in my file, but to this day, I have never used any of that sort of thing. And if I ever have a question, I can go on the internet or call somebody. Mm-hmm. Perfect example of all, you know, this kind of generic prescription thing, whereas with your kind of concept and our kind of concept of university, everyone gets fed a nutritive. They put in a nutritive environment, and you teach people instead of being competitive, and the academic baboonery is replaced by supportive and synergistic environment.
You know, and when you think about, too, in our education system, that they're removing all of, it seems, the arts that I think should be kept, especially in the early developmental education stages, and I'm talking about, for instance, kindergarten all the way up through junior high school. things such as art and music, the exploration of these things that actually help us enhance and develop our creativity. And they say, no, what we need to do is focus on, for instance, math, which is important, science, which is important, but history. Most of us really hated history until we became adults and understood why it was important, but why we're stuffing something like that down the throats of, for instance, a third grader.
I know, I got stuff plenty, and I didn't like it. But now you're right. When you get older, you start to me, living history is the way to go. I've actually been blessed with I held an original diary by Captain Cook in my hand on a trip down to Venezuela one time, and I had a job at my alma mater, Washington Lee University, over the holidays of reading George Washington and Robert E. Lee's original letters and doing little synopsis of them for the history department. Imagine that kind of original source contact. Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating stuff. The book is A Brave New Mind. Our guest joining us today, Elliot Maynard. Is there a website people can find out more about your work and perhaps even open their minds a little bit more?
Yes. First of all, the book is available on Amazon, both in e-book and paper format. And, of course, you can try a sample to see how you like it. Our website for our foundation, which is called Arcos Cielos, is ARCOSCIELOS.com. And our website is being revised. It's up and running, but we'll have a brand new one in about 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And I also have a series of interviews about the book on YouTube, so if you go there, you can Google my name, Elliot, 2 L's and 2 T's, Maynard, and you'll find it there.
And you'll certainly find it on our YouTube channel at 50 Beyond.
Wonderful.
Yeah, we have really enjoyed the kind of guests we brought on the program. For instance, John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. People will take a look at that and say, well, I can see how there's that pro going against the government, but he's also saying how people like him started shifting the way they were doing things and realizing we could do a lot of good with the kind of skills that we have. And there's just been some amazing progress as a result of that. And he was saying, for instance, that there was a time not even 10 years ago when you could go and you could talk with the average Harvard student what their goal was when they graduated. And almost unanimously they would all say to make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And he says nowadays what you're hearing from the average Harvard student is, I want to make a difference. And that's very encouraging to know because we kind of tend to beat up on our youth and they don't have the sense. But I think the youngsters today are smarter than we were at that age.
Well, I think there's a certain blessing in their ignorance, if I can use that term in quotes, of all the crap that we were fed, the linear stuff that we didn't use and had to go and learn in spite of the system. Am I right?
Well, I can actually ask you this, Elliot. Did you spend a lot of time in the principal's office? I had my very embarrassing moments. My dad was principal of the high school in the town I grew up in, so I had people watching me and would take me by the ear before I got into serious trouble. Right.
I won the main state science fair in biology, and I had a friend who won it in chemistry, and we had summer camps on the same lake. We got together, we built gunpowder, and we took a lot of photographs because he was a photographer. But we make our own bombs. We go in the hardware store and buy dynamite fuse. We check our .22 rifles out of the police range on the weekends and go shooting on the railroad tracks. I tell about these things in the book. People can't believe it, but it was just the way kids learned, you know. Country kids.
Well, I wondered that because I actually knew principals I even knew their extended families, and a lot of times I was one of the more higher achieving students in the class, but having been sort of labeled ADD, ADHD back in the 1970s, and then they were trying to throw me on Ritalin, for instance, and my mother says, enough of this nonsense. I don't want a zombie for a kid. I'll just take my chances.
Well,
sort of a thing. And you kind of wonder, these troublemakers, it's funny how you'll run into them if you get that chance years later and you see how well they're actually doing, and school was really the problem.
Absolutely. And you remember the voted most likely to succeed in your high school.
Yeah, they're usually alcoholics still stuck in the town. So.
Or selling cars or something, right? Yeah. And the geeks inherit the earth, right? They're the ones that come back with PhDs and big jobs in corporate world and all that. Yeah.
Funny stuff. I really think, and I know that our listeners out there, pick up A Brave New Mind. It's just really interesting, the different gamut of things that you talk about. And I kind of wanted to talk about remote viewing a little bit, because that's where I was kind of going when we were talking about, the superfoods that we're creating that allow your body to do what it can do. I mean, one of my favorite icons is Bruce Lee. And here was a guy back in his time that really tried to see how far can the body actually go, And that really becomes an interesting question when you think at the same time as you especially read your book, how far can the mind really go? It really seems there is no limits.
There is no limit, and that's the beauty of taking that tiny step to start recognizing, acknowledging the quantum field. And I give people a little analogy. I guarantee you, if you follow what's written in the book, and it's very simple, because things have been speeded up, our whole lives, everything we do, our consciousness has been refined in certain ways, we can achieve things that were not achievable in the same way 10 or 20 years ago. So all you need to do is imagine a switch in your mind. We're taught not to believe anything we cannot prove to be true, and then you go on with the statistics and all this sort of thing that university people like to spend all this time, churning. Mm-hmm. Instead, the garage inventor goes out and takes his new idea. He gets a little money together. They put a prototype, working prototype together, and then they start shifting it. They start changing that so that it works better and better, and refining it, removing the negatives, adding the positives, and this is how the world will work. And all you need to do is open yourself to the possibilities. Simply agree with yourself not to disbelieve, not believe anything you cannot prove to be untrue. Mm-hmm. Now, working in this quantum information field, this is a living information field. Great leaders and artists and military leaders and national leaders of the past have had access to this. But what I think is different now is that if we can do this consciously, I don't believe that many of them, like Leonardo da Vinci and others, did this so consciously. We can now see ourselves operating in this field and tune ourselves up and spread this to other people. Because one of the imperatives, the new imperatives for survival, is you got an offer you can't refuse. If you gain some wisdom or enlightenment or whatever you want to call it, you have to share it with others if you want to keep going.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I was wondering if this scenario actually could exist for you, and you sat and you were having coffee with Gene Roddenberry, what would you most like to ask him?
Well, I believe that Star Trek and leading edge sci-fi. I have been an addict for reading sci-fi all my life, and I remember as a child in like 4th or 5th grade, the teacher would ask me what you want to do, and I said I'd like to leave a mark in the world, and I'd like to be the first person to meet aliens when they come. Although I thought I would be really terrified at that thought. Now, when this becomes a reality, that there's plenty of evidence on this subject, it's one of the 25 keys written about in the book, where children just grow up accepting this. They accept from remote viewing. They accept the concept of you are what you eat, and the concept of the quantum field. My God, what a difference! What a different world this would be. There's no longer a death barrier. We can still communicate with people that leave the physical realm and interact with them in certain ways and it's like a graduation instead of something to be feared, especially as you grow older.
Mm-hmm. I like that approach because the whole idea is, well, I didn't know any better, so why not? Brave New Mind is the book. That website again, Elliot.
ArcosCielos.com. That's ArcosCielos.com.
Elliot, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
And thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure, Daniel, and I'm always so happy to find somebody that another member of the choir, or the tiger choir, I should say.
Very good. Well, the big band is coming back, but in a way that couldn't even be imagined.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for being on the program.
Well, thank you for having me.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Again, Brave New Mind is the book. Check it out. I'm sure it'll be very eye-opening for you. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.